There arrives a moment, quietly and without announcement, when you begin to sense that most of what unsettles you is not as accidental as it appears. Certain words stay with you longer than they should. Small incidents replay in your mind hours after they occurred. Reactions surge inside you before thought has had any chance to catch up. You work at remaining composed. You remind yourself repeatedly that none of it matters, and yet something continues to find its way through. What troubles you is not only the feeling itself, it is how effortlessly it arrives. How something that seems so minor manages to reach somewhere so deep, and you begin to wonder what genuine strength actually looks like. Not the kind that appears steady from the outside while something else is happening within. The kind that holds without needing to suppress. Because suppression does not work. Distance does not work. And reacting to everything only deepens the problem. Something in the equation is missing. And that is precisely where a more honest understanding begins to emerge. Carl Jung said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." That single idea moves the center of everything. It shifts the question away from what occurs and toward how you relate to what occurs. And when you begin to see that even dimly, something inside starts to change, you stop reaching outward for steadiness. You start directing attention inward, toward the way your mind processes what happens. Not to manage and control every experience, but to understand it with greater honesty. Because strength that is real is not the absence of being affected. It is the depth of awareness that prevents what happens from determining who you are. You have likely operated under a quiet assumption for most of your life, that what causes your pain is what other people do. Their words, their choices. The moments when they were absent and you needed them to be present. It feels self-evident. Someone treats you with disrespect and something rises in your chest before your mind has fully registered what happened. Someone walks away and it feels as though something essential was taken with them. Someone overlooks you and a low hum of tension builds, as though your value has just been silently assessed and found lacking. These responses feel instinctive, almost inseparable from the situations themselves. But if they were truly that automatic, if the event alone determined the feeling, then every person placed in identical circumstances would arrive at the same internal state. And they do not. Some people move through situations that completely destabilize others without losing their composure. Some encounter the same words and feel nothing register. That difference is not random. It points towards something happening inside, something that most people pass through their lives without ever stopping to examine. The moment you begin paying attention to this, something shifts. You realize that two people can share an identical experience and come away carrying entirely different things. One revisits every detail for days, the other releases it within the hour. The situation has not changed between them. What differs is the meaning each person attached to it. And that is where things begin to feel uncomfortable, because it challenges a belief most people hold without question, that your emotional condition is produced by the world outside you. What it actually suggests is something more nuanced. What you feel is not purely a reaction. It is something constructed, a meaning assigned with such speed that it presents itself as reality. But meaning is not fixed. It is shaped by memory, expectation, accumulated fear, and the particular story you have built about who you are. Once you see that, you begin to understand why the same moment can sink deep into one person while passing through another without leaving any trace. This is where most people stop, because moving forward requires releasing a particular kind of comfort. It is simpler to hold the belief that the world is the author of your inner experience. That arrangement keeps responsibility at a safe external distance. The Stoics reached a different conclusion. They understood that between what happens and what you feel, there exists a space where interpretation forms, usually without your awareness or participation. And within that space is where most of your suffering originates. Not in the event, in what you make the event mean. That recognition is uncomfortable because it places you face to face with your own patterns of mind. the tendency to take things as directed personally at you, the habit of reading indifference as rejection, the quiet, persistent need to be witnessed, approved of, and confirmed. These patterns were not installed overnight. They were built across years, reinforced so repeatedly that they began to feel like nature itself. But once you start watching closely, you see how fast the process moves. A message that arrives late becomes evidence of being ignored. A neutral expression becomes a sign of quiet disapproval. A simple disagreement becomes a personal challenge to your worth. None of these meanings exist inside the event, yet they feel convincing enough to produce a complete emotional response. And that is where the real fragility sits, not in what happens, but in the speed at which your mind assigns meaning to it. Because once meaning lands, the feeling follows almost without pause. And by the time you become aware of what is happening, you are already inside it. That is why it seems so resistant to control. You are not responding to what occurred. You are responding to a version of it that your mind had already shaped. As this understanding develops, something begins to loosen. You start to recognize that your first internal response is not the whole story. It is only the opening layer. Between that layer and your actual response, there is a gap. It is small, but it holds real significance. Within that gap, you can begin separating what actually took place from what you assumed it signified. You can question the assumption. You can slow the movement down, and sometimes that alone is enough to alter the entire direction. Not in one moment, not with perfect consistency, but enough to begin weakening the automatic hold these patterns have over you. With time, this changes the texture of your experience. What once felt impossible to manage begins to feel more workable. Reactions that once felt instantaneous begin to lose some of their speed. You do not stop feeling, but you stop being taken over by what you feel. And that is where a different form of strength begins to emerge, not the kind that resists or pushes away, but the kind that understands clearly enough that resistance is no longer needed. When you understand that your experience is shaped by how you interpret events, you also begin to see that interpretation is not a fixed thing. It can be looked at directly. It can be questioned. It can, over time, be refined. You do not erase pain, but you start removing the layers you were adding around it unnecessarily. And the more consistently you practice this, the more something inside you stabilizes. Not because the world has become more accommodating, but because your relationship with it has quietly changed. You stop requiring that everything proceed smoothly before you can feel grounded. You stop handing the governing of your inner state to whatever the current external moment happens to be. And that is where the shift becomes something you can actually feel. Something real, something that begins to change how you move through ordinary days. You still engage with life fully, but it no longer has the same authority over you that it once did. Consider how rapidly a moment can grow beyond what it actually contains. A single comment, a slight shift in someone's tone, a look that may not have been intentional at all, and somehow it follows you into the next hour, into subsequent conversations, sometimes into the following day. On the surface, the thing seems small, almost trivial, yet its effect carries weight that does not correspond to what actually occurred. That gap between the size of the event and the size of its impact is where something important becomes visible. Because if the moment truly were as minor as it appeared, it would not sustain itself the way it does. Something beneath the surface is amplifying it. Something that does not fully belong to the present moment. That something rarely announces itself clearly. It does not surface with a label. It operates beneath awareness, automatically shaping your response before conscious thought has arrived. What you feel in the moment seems immediate, direct, proportionate. But when you slow it down even slightly, you begin to see that the response did not originate in nothing. It connected to something that was already there waiting, a memory that did not rise consciously to the surface, an expectation you were holding without fully realizing it, a belief about yourself that has been sitting in the background, quietly anticipating confirmation. When the small moment arrives, it does not simply exist as itself. It activates everything that has been attached to it over time. This is where experience transitions from what is real into what is interpreted. The comment is no longer simply a comment. It becomes a signal of dismissal. The tone is no longer simply a tone. It becomes confirmation of disapproval. The look is no longer simply a look. It becomes a quiet judgment rendered about you. Once interpretation forms, emotional response follows as though it is inevitable. But what feels like a direct reaction to what is real is actually a reaction to what you have concluded it means. And meaning, unlike the events themselves, is not fixed. It is assembled so quickly and so automatically that it becomes nearly impossible to distinguish from the event that prompted it. As you begin to see this more clearly, it becomes easier to understand why certain moments affect you with a force that does not logically match what happened. It is not because you are unusually sensitive or lacking in resilience. It is because the moment has stopped being simply a moment. It has become part of a larger structure, a structure assembled from prior experience, reinforced through repeated interpretation, and rarely looked at directly. For as long as that structure holds, every new situation that even slightly resembles it will produce the same response. Not because the situation merits it, because it fits the established pattern. This is where most people discover they have unknowingly lost their footing, not in the moment itself, but in the automatic meaning they have assigned to it. They believe they are responding to what is occurring. They are actually responding to what they have concluded it signifies. Because that conclusion feels so immediate and so absolute, it rarely gets examined. It becomes the lens through which everything subsequent is filtered. And once you are consistently seeing through that lens, every new experience begins confirming the same belief. The pattern grows stronger, reactions become faster. The interval between event and interpretation narrows until it is almost invisible. Disrupting this pattern does not happen through force. Suppressing the reaction does not work. Pretending not to feel it does not work. Change begins with awareness, with noticing that the first meaning the mind proposes is not necessarily the only available meaning, that a gap exists between what happened and what you concluded from it. And in that gap there is room to examine, room to reconsider, room to encounter the moment from a slightly different angle. That room may be small in the beginning, but it is sufficient to begin shifting the pattern. As this awareness builds, the automatic quality of your reactions starts to decelerate. Not entirely, not immediately, but enough for you to begin observing them as they take shape. And once you are observing them, you are no longer fully captured by them. That movement, from being the reaction to watching the reaction form, is where your capacity for genuine response begins returning. Not control over what happens around you, control over how deeply it is allowed to penetrate. This is what creates the ability to reassign meaning. Not by demanding a more positive interpretation, but by loosening the grip of the first interpretation. By allowing for the genuine possibility that the situation may not carry the significance you initially placed on it. When that happens, the emotional intensity frequently decreases on its own. Not because the situation is different, because your relationship to it is. Seneca observed that we suffer far more in imagination than we do in reality. That is not a dismissal of genuine pain. It is an observation about how much of pain's weight is added by the stories we construct around it. Once you begin to see those stories, as interpretations rather than settled truths, you begin reclaiming something that was always yours, but that you rarely deployed with real intention. The capacity to see differently, and in seeing differently to experience differently. There comes a point where this understanding must move from concept into practice, not occasionally when circumstances allow, consistently. Because understanding that interpretation shapes experience is one thing, applying that understanding in the midst of an actual moment is something else entirely. This is where what people call stoicism stops being something you find intellectually interesting and becomes something you actually do. It becomes training, quiet, internal, unglamorous training that does not require ideal conditions. It requires only repetition, the repeated act of noticing when your mind begins moving toward exaggeration, toward unfounded assumption, toward distortion, and choosing to bring it back, not with force. With deliberate, patient attention, that act of noticing creates distance. Not the kind of distance that eliminates emotion, but the kind that prevents emotion from taking complete control. It allows you to see what is in front of you with less added weight, with less of the meaning you brought with you from somewhere else. When you see more clearly, the emotional intensity frequently adjusts by itself. Not because you are working to reduce it, but because you have stopped working to amplify it without realizing you were doing so. The mind intensifies whatever it holds its attention on, especially when that attention is driven by anxiety, insecurity, or anticipation of a particular outcome. When you shift your attention toward what is actually present, rather than toward what you fear it means, the intensity begins settling on its own. This kind of approach requires a form of genuine responsibility, because when you acknowledge that your interpretation is something you can examine, question, and gradually adjust, you stop experiencing yourself as entirely at the mercy of circumstances. You begin to see that while what happens is not always within your reach, how deeply it affects you can be influenced. And that influence is not exercised through willpower or suppression. It is exercised through clarity, through seeing what is there rather than what it immediately feels like. The difficulty with clarity is that it is not always comfortable to pursue. In many instances, it requires releasing interpretations that have become familiar, even when they are not accurate. It requires stepping away from habitual ways of thinking that have been reinforced over long periods. And in the absence of those patterns, there is a moment of genuine uncertainty, a moment in which you do not immediately know what to conclude or how to respond. That moment is not a failure of understanding. It is an opening, a point at which you are no longer bound by an automatic reading of the situation, a point at which a different response becomes genuinely available. Most people move past this opening without recognizing it exists. They close the gap between event and reaction so quickly, filling it with assumptions and premature conclusions that feel solid, that no actual examination takes place. The certainty this produces may be comfortable in the short term, but it sustains unnecessary suffering by keeping habitual interpretations in place. Staying in the opening, even briefly, requires patience. It requires the willingness to allow something to remain undefined for a moment longer. But when you begin to practice this, something changes. You start to see how much of what you previously experienced as reaction was actually a response to interpretation rather than to fact. You begin recognizing patterns in your own thinking that had been operating outside your awareness. And once you can see them, they lose some of their automatic authority. They do not disappear, but they become visible. And what is visible can be worked with. This becomes a form of internal discipline, not rigid or imposed, but steady and chosen. A consistent practice of returning attention to what is genuinely happening rather than to what your mind has already decided is happening. A habit of questioning your first reading of a situation, not to reject it, but to understand it more clearly before acting from it. And as that practice develops, the emotional charge attached to situations that once felt overwhelming begins to feel more manageable. You do not become unaffected. You become less easily swept away. You still register what happens. You still feel its impact. But the impact does not take over your entire internal state. It does not silently author your next thought, your next reaction, your next movement without any awareness on your part. And awareness is precisely where stability begins building. Because when you see clearly, you reduce the conditions for unnecessary suffering, not by making difficulty absent, but by removing the layers that have been making it larger than it needs to be. The practice continues not as a single realization, but as a repeating return, again and again, back to clarity. And with each return, the hold that external events exercise over you becomes fractionally weaker. Not because the world has changed, because the way you are choosing to see it has. Clarity has a particular quality that most people resist without recognizing they are doing so. Not openly, not with conscious intention, but in ways that are quiet and nearly invisible, because clarity dissolves illusion. And illusion, even when it is generating discomfort, often feels more manageable than facing something unfamiliar or uncertain. Illusion provides something to grip, something stable and consistent to navigate by, even if what it provides is distorted. It supplies a story that holds together, even when parts of that story are not accurate. And once that story is established, using it to move through the world feels easier than examining it each time something challenges its conclusions. This reliance does not always present itself in obvious forms. It does not always look like an explicit need for approval or external confirmation. More often it is subtler than that. It is the unspoken requirement that things proceed in a particular way before you can feel settled. The expectation that others will respond in ways that align with an internal standard you are holding. The quiet assumption that your environment should reflect your preferences. When it does not, when the response you anticipated does not arrive, when the alignment you expected is absent, something shifts internally. Not always dramatically at first, but enough to generate a quiet tension. Enough to pull your attention toward what you cannot govern rather than toward what you actually can understand. As this pattern becomes habitual, it becomes the unexamined background of your experience. You begin measuring your internal condition against external variables without noticing you are doing it. A positive interaction lifts you. A negative one lowers you. Silence produces doubt. Attention produces temporary relief. And without any conscious decision, your stability begins fluctuating according to factors that exist entirely outside your influence. This is the quiet place where fragility takes root, not in the events themselves, but in the dependence on them to maintain something that should belong to you independently. The Stoics approached this question from a different angle. Their aim was not the removal of emotion from experience. They were not pursuing a cold, empty form of detachment. What they focused on was the question of dependency. They understood that for as long as your inner condition is contingent on something external, you remain continuously exposed to it. Because the world outside does not behave consistently. People shift. Situations evolve. Outcomes change without regard for your preferences. And if your stability is anchored to those changes, your internal state will move with them. This understanding is why they returned repeatedly to the importance of grounding yourself in what is actually within your control, not as a philosophy you find interesting, but as a daily practice. A way of returning attention again and again to something that is stable, something that does not move every time the external situation changes. This does not mean turning away from the world or pretending that nothing reaches you. It means understanding honestly where your influence ends and where it begins. It means accepting that while you will inevitably experience what happens, you do not have to be constituted by it. There is a particular honesty this requires. The kind that involves looking directly at how you have been depending on external sources, even when that dependence felt entirely reasonable. It requires noticing how frequently your mood, your sense of yourself, and the direction of your thoughts shift in response to something that was never yours to control. That observation can feel uncomfortable at first, not because it reveals something shameful, but because it reveals something that has remained unexamined. A form of reliance that has been operating without your awareness or your consent. When you begin to see it clearly, the dynamic begins to shift. You realize that what you have been experiencing as instability does not originate entirely in what is happening around you. It originates in the degree of authority you have been granting those external things over your interior experience. That realization does not weaken you. It gives you something concrete to return to, a starting point for redirecting attention toward what actually belongs to you. Seneca observed that the person who relies on themselves is the most content. That is not an argument for isolation or the rejection of genuine connection. It is an argument for reducing unnecessary dependence on conditions you cannot control, for building a form of internal steadiness that does not need to collapse every time external circumstances change. And that steadiness does not come from becoming emotionally unavailable. It comes from understanding, from seeing clearly where feeling originates, what it attaches itself to, and how it moves through you. When dependency begins to reduce, something quiet shifts. You stop waiting for everything to align before allowing yourself to feel settled. You stop requiring continuous confirmation to maintain your sense of self. You still notice what happens. You still care. But what happens no longer reaches as deeply as it once did, because it has stopped being the foundation on which everything rests. And that raises the question more directly than before. If your stability is no longer borrowed from how external things unfold, if your sense of yourself is no longer contingent on how others respond, if your interior condition is no longer determined by things beyond your reach, then what remains for circumstances to take from you? That anchor is not something found outside. It is something constructed gradually, through awareness, through honest understanding, through the repeated practice of returning attention to what you can actually influence. It does not appear in a single moment. It forms slowly as you begin to recognize the patterns that were once running unchecked and start loosening their hold. In that process, the world does not become simpler, but your relationship with it becomes more honest. And in that honesty, the need to extract your steadiness from external sources begins to diminish. It is easy to misread where all of this leads. When people begin hearing about becoming less reactive, less affected, less dependent on what happens around them, they tend to assume it means becoming emotionally withdrawn, moving through life sealed off, untouched, disconnected from anything genuine, as though the destination were some kind of controlled numbness. But that is not strength. That is avoidance dressed in the language of discipline. Real strength does not emerge from shutting experience down. It emerges from understanding experience clearly enough that it no longer takes over. You do not stop feeling. You stop being taken away by what you feel. That distinction matters more than it initially appears. Being taken away means the feeling has become the authority in the moment. It governs your thinking, your perception of what is happening, your sense of who you are. It draws you into a narrative that feels complete and absolute, even when it is neither. When you are not taken away, the feeling is still present. You register it. You experience it, but you are not submerged in it in the same way. You are aware of it, and that awareness creates room in which something important becomes possible, a gap between what happens and what you then conclude about yourself because of it. That gap is where the real difficulty lies for most people. They collapse the two without pause. Something occurs and it is immediately personal. Being turned down becomes a verdict on your worth. Criticism becomes proof of fundamental inadequacy. Losing something becomes confirmation that something essential is absent within you. But those conclusions are additions. They are not present in the event itself. Once they are added, they change the entire shape of the experience. The feeling grows heavier. The moment becomes harder to move through. Not because of what actually happened, because of what it now means within the story you have attached to it. And meaning, when it is not examined, tends to expand. It reaches beyond the original moment, drawing in other memories, other fears, other established beliefs. Before long, the response is no longer to a single event. It is to an entire accumulated structure of interpretations. This is where precise seeing becomes essential, not analytical or rigid, but clear and grounded. Precision in this context means being able to distinguish between the event and the story you are telling yourself about the event. It means catching the moment when something that was not actually there has been added. That recognition does not take the feeling away. It changes your relationship with it. It prevents the feeling from becoming the total definition of the experience. This is what makes it possible to move through genuinely difficult moments without being dismantled by them. You can feel the ache of being turned away without concluding that you are fundamentally unworthy. You can hear criticism without absorbing it as a permanent truth about who you are. You can lose something that mattered without losing the sense of yourself in the process. These are not abstract principles. They are practical shifts in the way you see, shifts that change how you actually move through the days of your life. As this way of seeing becomes more practiced, you start noticing something that is both humbling and clarifying. Much of what you experienced as suffering was not produced by reality as it was. It was produced by the meaning you were layering over reality. Seeing that clearly does not diminish what you went through. It shows you where the weight came from. It identifies where something was added, where the reaction expanded beyond what the original event actually required. This is not an exercise in self-blame. It is an exercise in understanding. Because when you understand the process, you are no longer running entirely inside it. You can observe it. You can notice when meaning is being assigned too quickly or too absolutely. And in that noticing, something returns to you, a kind of choice that was always there but was not accessible before. That choice rarely announces itself with clarity at first. It can feel almost imperceptible, a moment in which you pause rather than moving immediately into reaction, a moment in which you question the conclusion your mind is already preparing, a moment in which you allow the feeling to exist without immediately anchoring it to your identity. These moments seem small. They accumulate in ways that are not immediately visible. They create a different pattern over time, and that pattern produces a different kind of stability. Not the kind that requires good conditions to maintain itself, but the kind that remains even when conditions are difficult. Because your sense of yourself is no longer attached to every outcome, every response from others, every external signal about how things are going. It is held by something that does not shift with every change in circumstances. This is where the understanding clarifies itself. Strength is not the removal of vulnerability. It is a clear enough understanding of vulnerability that it no longer controls you. It is knowing how it forms, where it originates, the particular shape it takes in your mind. And once you understand it at that level, it stops functioning as something you are subject to. It becomes something you can observe, something you can sit with without being swallowed by it. As Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will govern your life and you will experience it as destiny." When you are unaware of how you are assigning meaning, the reactions feel predetermined, feel like the only possible outcome of what happened. When you bring that process into awareness, it stops being automatic. It becomes visible. And what is visible can be understood. What is understood can be worked with, gradually, not perfectly, but in ways that actually matter. And in that gradual movement, the authority that these interpretations hold over you begins to diminish. You still live fully. You still feel the impact of what happens. But you are no longer defined moment to moment by every experience you move through. You begin to move differently, not by resisting what comes, but by seeing it more accurately. Not by pushing down what you feel, but by understanding what is actually producing it. And in that understanding, something durable begins forming. A way of inhabiting your own life that is not easily disrupted from the outside. In the moment when something happens, the whole process feels seamless. The response arises almost before awareness does. There is no visible separation between the event and the feeling that follows. They seem to occur as a single thing, and you move with them together. That is the default condition. That is how most people live, responding in continuous real time, never stepping far enough back to observe the process that is generating the response. But once you have begun to understand that a process exists, something shifts, even slightly, even for a moment. Because within that brief moment there is something that was not accessible before. Not the ability to stop the reaction entirely, the ability to see it as it begins forming, to notice the shift before being completely absorbed by it. And that noticing creates space, not a vast or dramatic space, enough to observe. enough to recognize that what you are experiencing is not simply the event. It is your interpretation wrapping itself around the event as you encounter it. This is where practice becomes something real rather than something described. The capacity to pause, even briefly, even imperfectly, before committing fully to a reaction. To ask honestly what is actually happening without immediately accepting the first response your mind offers. To look at the situation as it is before meaning has been attached to it. These are small internal movements. From the outside they are nearly invisible, but they alter the entire character of the experience from within. In the beginning, this pause feels artificial, like you are interrupting something that has been running automatically for a long time. The mind has preferences. It prefers to move quickly, to close the story, to assign clear meaning and produce a definitive narrative. Pausing disrupts that preference, and the disruption can feel uncomfortable. It introduces a moment of not knowing. But within that moment of not knowing, something more honest becomes available, because you are no longer rushing toward a conclusion. You are allowing yourself to see more of what is actually there before deciding what it means. With practice, the pause becomes less foreign, not necessarily longer, but more reliably accessible. You begin recognizing the early signals of a reaction forming, the subtle tension that arrives first, the particular shift in thought, the impulse toward immediate interpretation. And rather than following that impulse instantly, you stay with it just long enough to see it more clearly. The clarity that follows does not eliminate the reaction, but it changes how you stand in relation to it. You are no longer fully merged with what you are feeling. You are aware of the feeling and simultaneously aware of yourself as the one who is observing it. In that doubled awareness there is space. Space in which you can choose how to respond. Space to genuinely ask whether the meaning you are assigning is accurate. Space to consider whether this particular moment deserves the weight you are about to give it. This is the point where something that genuinely deserves the name control begins. Not authority over what happens to you. The authority to determine how deeply you allow it to enter. And that authority is not a product of effort or suppression. It is the product of understanding the process well enough that you are no longer swept along by it unconsciously. You are present in it. You are participating in it with awareness. Over time, that participation becomes your natural way of engaging. The interval between what arrives and how you respond to it becomes more consistent. Not because the situations you face have become easier. Because your awareness of your own process has deepened, you start encountering moments that would previously have drawn you into a strong automatic reaction. And instead of being absorbed by them, you find yourself watching them. You still feel something, but it does not escalate in the familiar way. And in that space, something important continues forming, a quiet, internal steadiness that does not require smooth conditions to maintain itself. Because even when things are not smooth, you are not responding from the same automated place. You are seeing more, understanding more, choosing with greater awareness. This is what produces genuine freedom. Not freedom from difficulty. Freedom within it. The ability to be present for something without being completely shaped by it. The ability to respond with intention rather than follow the path of least resistance. The ability to hold your ground even when something unexpected arrives. That capacity grows with consistent practice. Each moment of genuine awareness reinforces it. Each pause makes the one that follows slightly more accessible. Each act of observation weakens the automatic authority of reaction by a small but real degree. And over time, what once felt immediate and beyond influence begins to feel workable. You develop a growing trust that you can engage with what arises, not because you can determine how things turn out, but because you can meet them differently than you once did. That trust produces something quiet, something that does not need to announce itself. Because you have repeatedly witnessed what becomes possible when you slow down. You have lived the experience of the space between event and response. And you have recognized that within that space there is something that belongs to you and cannot be simply taken, something steady, something built, something that holds. At some point, without a clear moment you can point to, things begin to feel different. Not in the world around you. The world continues as it always has. People still move unpredictably. Situations still shift without consulting you first. Words are still spoken, sometimes carelessly, sometimes with full awareness of their effect. None of that changes. But your relationship to it begins to change in a way that is difficult to fully articulate until you have lived it directly. It is not that you stop noticing what happens. It is that what happens no longer arrives with the same force. There is no immediate internal collapse, no sudden grip of reaction before thinking has had any chance. The impulse may still form, but it does not take over. It passes through something that was not there before. A space constructed through awareness, through practice, through repeatedly choosing to see clearly rather than to respond automatically. And within that space something holds, something steady, something that does not travel at the same speed as everything outside of it. You begin observing more, not from a cold or removed place, but from a grounded and genuinely attentive one. You notice what is said, but you also notice how your mind begins constructing an interpretation around it. You register what happens, but you do not immediately decide what it means. Something opens briefly before it is fixed. And that brief opening changes everything, because once something is closed too quickly, it becomes difficult to see past the conclusion. When you allow things to remain open a moment longer, you give yourself genuine room to encounter them more honestly. This shift arrives quietly. It does not feel like a breakthrough. It resembles a gradual settling, a reduction in the unnecessary friction that was previously consuming so much. A growing sense that not every situation requires the same level of urgency in response. That not every word carries the weight you were previously assigning it. And in that growing sense, something that had been held tightly begins to release. You assume less, not because you have made a rule for yourself, but because you have observed enough times how quickly the mind fills space with stories that feel convincing but are often inaccurate. And having seen it enough times, you become more careful, not tentative, but genuinely more precise. You allow what is present to be what it is before you decide what it means. That precision changes how emotion moves through you. You still feel. That is not altered, but the feeling no longer inflates beyond what is actually there. It does not draw in unrelated history or imagined futures in the same way. It stays closer to the actual moment, more contained, more proportionate. And because it is more proportionate, it does not overwhelm the entirety of your experience. It does not quietly take over everything that follows. A form of steadiness emerges, not rigid, not performed, but real and consistent. It does not require favorable conditions to maintain itself. It does not vanish when something unexpected arrives. It is simply present, regardless of how the situation is moving. And that presence becomes something you can genuinely rely on. Not because it is powerful in every moment, but because it is reliably there. This is where the understanding becomes felt rather than simply known, the understanding that nothing and no one can disturb you in the way they once could. Not because life has lost its ability to reach you, because the way you engage with it has fundamentally shifted. You have stopped handing over the authority to define your interior experience to whatever the current moment presents. You have stopped allowing what happens externally to determine how you see yourself, how you feel about what you are, how you respond to what comes. That authority returns to you gradually, not through a single decision, but through repeated small acts of awareness. Each time you pause rather than reacting automatically, something is reclaimed. Each time you question a conclusion rather than accepting it reflexively, the return deepens. And over time, those small recoveries accumulate into something substantial. What changes is not only how you respond, it is how you understand yourself within those responses. You no longer see yourself as someone continuously subject to whatever the world is doing. You begin seeing yourself as someone who participates in experience rather than being determined by it. And that shift, subtle as it appears, changes everything. Because once you carry that understanding about yourself, external events simply cannot take it from you in the same way. They can still produce discomfort. They can still generate frustration or grief or difficulty, but they no longer reach the foundation in the same way. They no longer define what is stable within you. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the power you have is over your own mind, not over what happens outside you, and that recognizing this is where genuine strength begins. That strength does not need to perform itself. It does not require demonstration. It simply appears in the way you respond when things do not go as you expected, in the way you hold yourself when pressure arrives. You stop needing everything to be under your direction in order to feel grounded. You stop requiring others to behave according to your needs in order to feel secure. You stop needing continuous external confirmation that you are adequate, not because those things are without value, but because they are no longer what your stability depends on. There is a clear difference between preference and necessity. You can genuinely prefer that things go well, that people are fair, that situations develop in your favor, without needing those outcomes to remain standing. That difference produces a form of freedom that is genuinely difficult to disrupt from the outside. You move through what comes with more clarity, more patience, and more consistent awareness, not without difficulty, not without moments of genuine challenge, but with a steadiness that was not present before. And that steadiness becomes the foundation from which everything else operates. The world continues as it always has, but it no longer finds the same places to unsettle you. Not because those places are gone, because you have understood them. You have seen how they form, how they operate, how they can be met differently. And once something is genuinely understood at that level, it loses some of its authority. Not entirely, but enough to change your actual experience of it. Enough to create room where reaction once moved instantly. Enough to let you remain grounded when the circumstances around you are not. That steadiness is not fixed permanently in place from a single realization. It is something maintained, something you return to, something reinforced through ongoing awareness and continued practice. But once it is present, even in early form, it becomes a reference point, a reminder of what genuine clarity makes available. There comes a point where you understand that nothing outside of you ever held the power you believed it did. It was never the world that required transformation. It was the way you were carrying it, the way you were seeing it, the degree to which you were allowing it to define you. And when that understanding shifts, even fractionally, you begin moving differently, more settled, more clear, less easily reached by what once reached you so easily. Not because life became simpler, because something in how you meet it did. If something in this reached you honestly, do not let it remain as an interesting idea. There is another video on your screen right now that takes this further. Watch it, and keep building the steadiness, one step, one moment of awareness at a time.